Okay, 30 seconds till we go live, everyone.
Hello and welcome to our program with Janice Tomlinson, titled Los Disparates and Goya's Late Works, Triumphs of Caprice. I want to thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan Hardesty and I am the Executive Director here at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. I'd like to first begin by acknowledging Washington State University Pullman campus is located on the homelands of the Nimiipuu tribe and the Palouse people. We acknowledge their presence here since time immemorial and recognize their continuing connection to the land, to the water, and to their ancestors. Today, we welcome Janice Tomlinson, a preeminent Goya scholar in conjunction with the museum's new exhibition, World Without Reason, Goya's Los Disparates. The exhibition puts on view a very significant print cycle by the Spanish master completed in the later part of his artist's life. This first edition portfolio of etchings came to the museum as a gift from the Washington State University's Friends of the Library, shortly after the museum's original formation in 1973. Today's program is also very special in that it is a John Matthews Friel Memorial Art Lectureship, named for John Friel, a 1962 WSU Fine Arts graduate. Since 1973, this program has brought to WSU renowned artists, critics, and art historians, such as Robert Motherwell, Dory Ashton, Fred Wilson, Roger Shimomura, and Wendy Redstar, to name just a few. And now, very happily, Janice Tomlinson as well. I'd like to turn to Kristen Becker, the museum's education coordinator, who will introduce our very special guest. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kristen Becker, and I'm the education coordinator here at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. And I'm so pleased to welcome and introduce Janice A. Tomlinson, who's joining us remotely from the East Coast in Delaware. Janice is an internationally recognized authority on Francisco Goya. She's authored several books on the artist and lectured widely in the US, Europe, and Latin America. She's contributed essays to exhibition catalogs in Spain, France, and Mexico. And she was the US curator for the exhibition Goya Images of Women at the Museo del Prado in Spain and the National Gallery of Art in Washington. Most recently, in 2020, Janice published a definitive biography of Francisco Goya. It's called Goya, A Portrait of the Artist, and it's published by Princeton University Press. And it's an amazing biography for many, many reasons, but in light of our current exhibition on Goya's Los Disparates, it's especially significant because in the biography, Janice reconsiders the conventional interpretation of Goya's late years as kind of a period of disillusion. And she views them instead as years of liberated artistic innovation. And so we will learn so much about our current exhibition at the museum through Janice's lecture. And when she's done speaking, she will be happy to answer questions, both about the lecture, but about Goya in general. She's very generously offered to do that. So we have our live streamed chat going. Please contribute your questions throughout the lecture. And at the end, we'll moderate those questions as time allows. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Janice Tomlinson to the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art.
I believe you're muted, Janice.
There. It's much better when you hear me, isn't it? Good evening. Good afternoon on your side of the country. It is really a pleasure to be here. As you might guess, I've spent from the many years I've spent on Goya. I love talking about Goya. I am truly indebted to both Kristen and Ryan for giving me the opportunity to be here with you and to talk about one of the most engaging series of Goya's etchings. and a little bit about how they fit within his life and within his life. So I'm going to bring on my presentation, and I look forward to answering your questions and a good discussion after the lecture. Thank you. The year is 1815. In his studio in Madrid, the Spanish artist Francisco Goya places a prepared canvas measuring about 18 by 14 inches on his easel, with a mirror to the left. He leans back slightly to look at his reflection before making the first mark on the canvas, beginning the process of the self-portrait now on the screen. He continues, looking from mirror to canvas, making marks as his image takes form. He submits himself to the same scrutiny which the many sitters whose portraits he had painted had once endured. His concentration was intensified undoubtedly by the absence of distractions, given that Goya had lost his hearing years earlier at the age of 47. But in contrast to his many portraits of monarchs and aristocrats, Goya offers few details to establish his social position or identity. We see neither his easel nor his palette, and only the ruffled collar of his shirt, worn under a dark reddish-brown robe, suggests a comfortable existence. Nothing distracts Goya, or the viewer who intercepts his self-scrutiny. This is the portrait of a survivor who had lived in Madrid throughout the violence, famine, and political turmoil that began 7 years earlier in 1808 with the forced abdication of the Spanish monarch in favor of his son, and shortly after, the abdication of both Spanish rulers in favor of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon, in turn, proclaimed his brother Joseph king of Spain. Joseph Bonaparte ruled Spain with some interruptions from June 1808 to May 1813. Now, although Goya painted members of Joseph's court, and possibly, and I think probably, the king himself, he never accepted an official salaried position at the court of the so-called Rey Intruso, intruder king. This served him well as proof of his loyalty to the Spanish monarchy throughout the French occupation. Following the return of the Spanish king, Fernando VII, whose portrait by Goya is on the left, with witnesses who testified to his loyalty to the Spanish regime throughout the French occupation, Goya was reappointed to his position as first court painter. On the right is the portrait of the king's loyal minister, the Duke of San Carlos, painted as part of the same commission. Goya painted both in 1815, the same year as the self-portrait with which we began. Together, they hang in this configuration on long-term loan to the Museum of Goya's hometown, Saragossa, and it is likely that they were intended for such an arrangement. The king, wearing the robe of the Golden Fleece set off by the ermine collar of his, wearing the Order of the Golden Fleece set off by the ermine collar of his robe, with scepter in hand, does not deign or turn to acknowledge the Duke. The Duke, a perfect courtier, has removed his hat and waits patiently, ready to present the petition he holds in his right hand to his monarch. During the next 5 years, Goya's artistic production remained as wide-ranging as it had ever been. In October 1816, he published 33 etchings advertised in the newspaper the Diario de Madrid as scenes of, and I quote, the various maneuvers of the bullfight and the plays performed in our bull rings. In fact, the series offers a history of the bullfight in Spain, from early fighters in the open country to Moors, here on the left, who confront a bull who seems far more perplexed than violent. The story continues with the image on the right, which, according to the title assigned to it afterwards, shows the Emperor Charles V fighting a bull in the ring of Valladolid. but the costume worn by the writer is more that of a Napoleonic soldier than of a 16th century ruler, suggesting possibly the subtext, a reference to the attempt of a more recent emperor, Napoleon, to subdue the Spanish bull. A year later, with the help of his friend, the collector and art historian Juan Agustin San Bermudez, Goya was given a lucrative commission to paint an altarpiece for the Cathedral of Seville, where it can be seen today, depicting the city's patron saints, Justa and Rufina. Those familiar with Seville will recognize the Tower of the Giralda in the background. Now, such a work is not what we normally associate with Goya, but in fact, he had a very extensive and very successful career as a painter of religious subjects, for which he was well known among his contemporaries who received this particular altarpiece extremely well. He also continued to paint portraits, adapting his style to his sitters. Painting in 1816, he creates a format suitable for a gentleman in painting the 10th Duke of Osuna, who's on the left, the son of Goya's longtime patron, the Duchess of Osuna. He has interrupted his afternoon ride to read a letter as his groom holds his horse behind. On the right, Goya adopted a more conservative style, painting 2 years later the academician and architect Juan Antonio Cuervo in a lovely portrait, unfortunately not that often seen in the museum in Cleveland. And again, I just want to draw attention to the incredible variety of Goya's paintings, 1816 on the left, 1818 on the right, and 1820 now, when he turned to paint the nephew of the older Cuervo, Tiburcio Pérez, in a well-known portrait in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And the marvelously rendered uniform of the older man, where Goya details brocades and reds and golds and grays and brings all those colors to play in detailing the face of the older man, the colors become far more subdued in the less formal rendering of his nephew. With colors more limited in range, it is Goya's broader, more fluid brushworks that really enlivens the image. More private works of these years included these two scenes. On the left, as Goya imagines customs of the past. On the left, a religious procession with half-naked men flagellating themselves, penitents, outlawed in the mid-18th century because, in fact, it seems young men in villages were using this exercise to show themselves off to young women in the audience, which was considered quite indecent. On the right, a trial of the Inquisition, where a mob of monks of various orders, according to the ropes, has gathered in a somewhat Gothic church as witnesses. But by Goya's day, such trials took place on a much smaller scale, with very few onlookers in attendance, if any. But these paintings also introduce a motif we find again in the Disparates, which are approximately contemporary with these paintings, possibly a little later, where he creates scenes witnessed by a crowd, and that crowd remains passive. So the oppression or the superstition is witnessed, no one intervenes, and thus crowds become sort of collaborators in their own oppression. This very brief overview of Goya's work from 1815 to 1820, that is from his 69th to his 74th year, serves to underscore that during these years, to which the Disparates are usually dated, Goya had a very active and successful public career. Too often, we imagine the aged artist alone, embittered and deaf in his studio, madly etching his visions, but this was not the case. One letter even offers a vignette of his personal life as part of a group that gathered at a guest house not far from his home in Madrid to drink and play cards. Goya never published these etchings during his lifetime. People ask why, and for a long time, if Goya didn't publish anything, people would say, oh, censorship. But probably not. There is no record of any censorship, and there's no record that Goya's contemporaries even knew of these prints, except for a few of his inner circle. But Goya was a very practical man. And in publishing Los Caprichos, a series of etchings published in 1799 that we'll look at briefly, he had probably lost a lot of money, so much so that he turned the plates over to the Royal Printing Establishment 4 years after the publication, along with about 270 sets that hadn't sold. So Goya was aware of the financial obligation printing an edition entailed. And he also probably knew that the art of the Disparates was far beyond the understanding of the market in Spain in the second decade of the 19th century. So he etched the plates and then stored them. They were inherited by his son and then passed to his grandson, who looked for a buyer. They were eventually acquired, or 18 of them were acquired, by the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in San Fernando in Madrid, where a selection is today on view. And if you visit the Academy, stop in at the first floor Calcografia, and you'll see a lovely exhibition of Goya's etched plates. Thus, it was the Royal Academy that published them in 1864, 36 years after Goya's death, with the title page on the left from the first edition now on view at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum. The academicians, it seems, were as perplexed as we are by the meaning of these images and sort of threw up their hands and called them proverbs. Now, you may have noticed that I have not used titles in my slides, and there are two reasons for this. First, in the current world of remote learning, many of us are viewing this on a small screen, and some of you may even be viewing it on a phone. I realize that. And adding title to only sort of distracts from the space that is allowed for images. But also, of Goya's 5 series of etchings, prints after Velázquez, his Caprichos, the Disasters of War, the Tauromaquia, which are the bullfight prints we just saw, and these prints, only the prints after Velázquez and Los Caprichos have titles engraved, and probably not engraved by the artist, but probably written by the artist and engraved by someone else. The bullfight scenes were published without titles, although they were subsequently added. And titles were assigned to the Disasters of War some years after they were created. That is to say, I want to stress that Goya is not like an English caricaturist John Gilray that thinks of a verbal idea and then illustrates it. Goya begins with image and creates images, and afterwards, like many contemporary artists, assigns titles. But following the publication of these etchings as proverbios, or proverbs, impressions of the prints with a title in script, generally considered to be in Goya's hand, came to light. I show one of those, Disparates desordenado, now on the screen. Added as afterthoughts, these titles began with the word disparate, which has been variously translated as folly or absurdity. But for me, these translations fall short. Webster's associates folly with foolishness and absurdity with the ridiculously unreasonable, unsound, or incongruous, or having no rational or orderly relationship to human life. The Oxford English Dictionary doesn't get us much further, defining folly as foolishness, deficiency in understanding, nonsense, and absurdity, or with something extremely unreasonable, illogical, or inappropriate, or of arousing amusement or derision. But the association of these terms with foolishness or amusement seems to me inappropriate to Goya's frequently cruel subject matter, as does the idea that they have no rational or orderly relationship to human life. Because, in fact, these etchings do relate to human life, and therein, I think, lies their power. On the screen is Disparate desordenado, often translated as disorderly, although during Goya's day, the word desordenado meant confused, but could also mean given over to vices or malevolence. A man and woman are indissolubly conjoined, but the stronger male is in complete control. He bends and pulls the woman back. Helpless, she cries in pain. No one among the motley crowd of half human figures intervenes. Why is cruelty inflicted? Why is it not challenged? The image goes beyond the folly to tragic to the uncanny, evoking a strangeness that hardly amuses. It unsettles. We can describe these images, but we can hardly explain them or reduce them to narrative, which clearly problematizes the task of any art historian who sets out to explain them. These are not follies, they're just pure irrationalities. Where did the Disparates come from? I pose a question that I cannot fully answer, but I would like to approach nevertheless by looking at words by Goya that reveal his thoughts about the potential of images. The first are from a report he wrote about 25 years before undertaking the Disparates, in response to a request made by the director of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. Pardon the barking dogs. There's really nothing I can do about that. Goya was among several professors asked to submit their ideas for reforming curriculum. But unlike his colleagues, he responded with what is perhaps the most anti-academic diatribe ever written by an academician. He opens with the statement, "Academies should not be exclusive or serve more than as an aid to those who freely wish to study in them, banishing all servile subjection of the primary school, mechanical precepts, monthly prizes, financial aid, and other trivialities that degrade and effeminate an art as liberal and noble as painting." He continues, "I will give proof to demonstrate with facts that there are no rules in painting, and that the oppression or servile obligation of making all study or follow that same path is a great impediment for the young who profess this very difficult art, that approaches the divine more than any other, since it makes known all that God has created. He who has most closely approached this art will be able to give few rules concerning the profound operations of understanding that are needed for it, nor explain why he has perhaps been more content with a work where less care has been taken than with one of greater finish. What a profound and impenetrable arcanum is encompassed in the imitation of divine nature, without which there is nothing good." Goya's words, presented to the Academy in October 1792, thus placed divine nature as the artist's teacher, which should replace academic courses in geometry and perspective, lessons that, he states elsewhere in the report, artists learn as they imitate nature. There should be no boundaries to what an artist might choose as their subject, and no rules on how to represent it. After presenting his report to the Royal Academy, Goya fell ill for several weeks, but apparently recuperated sufficiently to teach his quarterly turn the following January before leaving Madrid to travel to Andalusia. There he suffered an illness that left him deaf for life. He returned to Madrid in late spring 1793, but he absented himself from the Academy after attending only one meeting, which he surely could not follow given his new deafness. In January of the following year, he sent to the Academy 11 small paintings and asked the director to present them to his colleagues at their meeting the following day. The minutes of the meeting mentioned that the academicians saw the works and praised both the artist and his paintings of national pastimes. The Strolling Players, today in the Museo del Prado, may well have been one of those paintings. These paintings then defied the strictures of commission works. In the letter to the director that accompanied the paintings, Goya described them as a set of cabinet paintings in which I have been able to make observations for which there is no place in commissioned works, in which whimsy, capriccio, and invention have no room to grow. From this point on, Goya continued to defy those limits, experimenting in drawings, etchings, and paintings, which he created as his public career also flourished with commissioned works for the court, the church, and other patrons. This experimentation evolved through drawings into the etchings that he published in 1799, Los Caprichos. The frontispiece self-portrait for that series is now on the screen. But the advertisement for those etchings, published in the Madrid newspaper in February 1799, attests that the artist now had gone beyond the imitation of nature to transcend her, and I quote, "And if it is difficult to imitate nature, as it is admirable when imitation is achieved, he who departs from her entirely will not be left without deserving some esteem for having had to expose to the eye forms and attitudes that until now only existed in the human mind, obscured and confused by lack of enlightenment or heated by unbridled passion." Thus, in 7 years, Goya's idea about art evolved from art that emulates nature to art that goes beyond her to give form to images created by the unenlightened human mind. No further writings by Goya about the meaning or objective of art had come to light, but I believe that the words he published in 1799 provide a point of departure for approaching Los Disparates as creations of a mind obscured and confused. The title of this lecture derives from the final section of my biography of Goya, and that is the final section being entitled Triumphs of Caprice. As Kristen noted, I consider the works of Goya's last decade, among them the Disparates, the so-called black paintings, and his works in Bordeaux, particularly his drawings, evidence the artist's ultimate liberation from patronage and from concerns about whether or not his viewers would comprehend his inventions. Rather than a period of bitter, isolated old age, I believe it is a period of creativity and fulfillment in which the artist pushed all limits of representation. Although my initial idea in accepting this invitation was to revisit individual disparates and discuss their imageries, when I began to try and do that, I realized that no, I still don't believe these images can be reduced to rational meaning. And I remain very skeptical of interpretations that narrow their meaning to some kind of commentary, usually political. They are, in the end, visual conundrums, and any answers, I believe, we impose will always remain conjectural. Instead, in the time remaining, I'd like to look at the Disparates within the broader context of Goya's art in hope of illustrating their uniqueness and their place as a turning point and introduction to the works of Goya's final decade. To begin, let's consider how Goya's imagery had evolved during the 15 to 20 years that separate the Disparates from the etchings of Los Caprichos, as I've mentioned several times, published in 1799. On the left, Lo que puede un sastre, what a tailor can do, from the Caprichos series, and on the right, an image that we today call Disparate de miedo, irrationality of fear. We begin with dimensions. Each of the images of the Caprichos measures about 8.5 by 6 inches. And those of the Disparates measure about 9.5 by 14 inches, about twice the size. And you may be better at this than I am. I can never imagine sizes. I always think that I say 8.5 and 6, and I put up my hand, and then I sort of increase the size to 9.5 by 14. And when you do that, you realize the change in scale, which helps explain the differences we see in these images. The scale of Los Caprichos complements the delicacy of their etchings, in which Goya carefully represents individuals and expressions. We see sort of the somewhat terrified but subdued woman of the woman who, expression of the woman who prays before a dead tree garbed in the robe, something like that, of a monk. And that is juxtaposed to the, unqualified, absolute terror of her child. And he picks up even in the crowd behind expressions of people, detailing those things. He also uses tone, and those of you familiar with etching will recommend, the tonal fields that are created by aquatint. And he uses different shades of aquanin, a very light shade, still a very light shade, even on the woman's neck. Her face has no tone, it's the tone of the paper. And yet here we see different tones of aquatint to pull out figures in the crowd behind. We see tones of aquatint to suggest shadows on the ground. Working on the plate of Disparate de Miedo, however, the etching becomes less subtle. Contrasts are sharper and the etching more bold. Compare, for example, the etched lines on the ground in both etchings, the dark shadows here or these etched lines. Cast shadows in the Caprice suggests daytime, but the Disparate takes place, like many of the etchings of the series, in a world of darkness. Working on a larger plate, however, enables Goya to create a complex scene that raises more questions than it answers. A phantom appears before a group of soldiers, as others fight in the background. What does the phantom signify? We might first think it's the Grim Reaper and the soldiers run in fear. But looking closely, we discover a grinning face that peers out from the phantom's right sleeve. The only clear expressions in the compositions are those of the two men in the foreground. This man who seems to make contact with the grinning face, and this man who has not seen the face and just reacts in fear, which as do most of his colleagues before the phantom. Confronting a charade then, a phantom of just a masquerade, a charade, the remaining figures illustrate how fear overrides rational consideration of the phantom. Rather than question what the shrouded figure is, panic dominates. Fear of an illusion, created and empowered by the human mind, recurs as a theme of one of the best-known works painted by Goya directly on the plaster walls of a house he purchased on the outskirts of Madrid. He purchased the house in 1819. He probably began the paintings around 1820. He surely finished them by 1823 when he willed the house to his grandson. And I show on the upper right a sort of reconstruction of the entire series. It was 2 floors. You can see on the upper floor where there might have been more light, the paintings have more sky, more open space, but they're really very dark and lugubrious on the lower floor where you see the painting, which is today known as the Witch's Sabbath. But restorers' early photographs taken before these were removed from the walls of the house in the early 1870s point out that this painting was in fact cropped by a good 4 or 5 feet on its right side. So if you imagine that added back in and our eye allowed to meander down through a distant landscape, you might agree with me that the center of the painting clearly shifts, it's not about the devil as a he-goat. It's about the fear and the faces and the awe of these people. So it is about, once again, it's about fear. It's an irrationality of a fear. Because now what they fear is not even a phantom, a tree in a robe. It is just a silhouette, a creation of their own imagination. Another recurrent theme in Goya's art is the individual tormented, seen in his altarpiece of the Arrest of Christ, completed in January 1799, which was commissioned for the Cathedral of Toledo, Spain, and is still in the cathedral in the sacristy. And I compare that, and a month later he announced the Caprichos for sale, where we again find an individual tormented, which as a crowd jeers a woman accused by the Inquisition. That same theme enters into his scenes on the left of the famine, the wartime famine, which devastated Madrid from 1811 to 1812, an image that was eventually published as part of the Disasters of War. It's a very moving image. as you see a man starving, wearing only a sort of a sheet, a tunic, begging, his hand reached out. There is a woman at his side, there is a dead or dying child. He seems to be a family group. And yet behind you have two very well-dressed men. And indeed, these disparities existed in wartime Madrid. Some went through very good stead. And again, and both of them imitate, coolly mock the outstretched hand of the starving man. That mock not only his need, but also the deaths or the impending deaths of the victims of the famine. Gratuitous cruelty becomes the subject of the Disparate titled Loyalty. A plate with the Disparate title has not been found for this imagery, so it's Loyalty as a modern title. Now, no reason is given for the derision of the individual at the center of the image, whose face melts in misery and possible fear of the imminent torture signaled by the syringe held by a man in the background. The only humaneness, in fact, is to be found in this world without morality, is that of a small dog at the victim's feet who barks futilely to protect his master. And I've supplied the dog barking to give you a feel of what's really in the image. We do not have time to discuss the Napoleonic War in Spain or Goya's etchings, the disasters of war inspired by it. But the war was undoubtedly a critical turning point in Goya's life and art, and I think the darkness revealed in Los Disparates attests to its influence. Would these etchings have been created had there never been a war? I tend to think not. On the left is an etching probably created after the hostilities of the war had ended, because it is on because it's on a very nice copper plate and belongs to a series that was made when copper became available again following the end of the hostilities. And it was eventually published with the disasters of war. Popolaccio, as per the written title, or rabble in English, here take revenge on a man who, given the uniform, is probably a French soldier, but may also be a Spaniard who supported the French regime. The crowd looks on at the torture. No one intervenes. The context of the war suggests the narrative and the rationale. Both are absent, however, from the Disparate on the right. A man appears to torture another, but his pike seems not to pierce his victim's head. This is just a show of bravado. The aggressor stares at another man who turns his back, although faces the man, seemingly challenging him to intervene. We imagine the screams, we imagine the shouts, but others pay no heed to the attacker or to his assumed victim. What is going on here? What motivates this man with the pike? Is he dangerous, a raging lunatic, or an empty threat? The nonchalance of the figures suggests the latter, but Goya leaves the question open. Not all the images of the Disparates are as grim as those I have been discussing. Feminine Disparate, on the right, looks back to a theme first presented by Goya in a design for a tapestry cartoon painted almost 3 decades earlier. In that cartoon, women toss a mannequin in a blanket, and the verdant landscape suggests a pastoral entertainment. The figure tossed is clearly a straw doll of an effeminate man, a type known as the petit maître, often mocked in satires of the day. In the etching, the pastoral game is moved, again, to a barren and dark landscape. It's unclear whether the figures tossed are puppets or humans, and in the blanket we detect the outlines of a donkey and a male figure. This is no normal game. Goya's irrationalities can also be humorous and possibly self-referential, as the septuagenarian recasts the circle game again, first seen in a design for a tapestry to be woven to be decorated a royal apartment on the left. The Disparate Allegre, the merry disparate, the merry irrationality, in it, the circle game becomes a free-form celebration of not-so-young women and old men with bagging breeches, having a raucous and very jolly time. Just as age did not hinder Goya's creativity, so it does not lessen their mirth. In 1824, Goya left Madrid to settle in Bordeaux among a growing colony of Spaniards. Although many others were political refugees, Goya himself was not. He asked the king for permission to leave Spain, ostensibly to take the waters for his ailments, something he never did. He renewed his permission at the required intervals, first every 6 months, then a year would pass, until he requested retirement in 1826, after serving the Spanish court for a half century. When he returned that summer to request his retirement personally, the king ordered that his now favorite portraitist, Vicente Lopez, paint Goya in this work, soon installed in the Museo del Prado, where it remains today. A portrait that I think shows Goya very much as he would want to be portrayed, as a painter, as an artist, as a very accomplished, a very well-to-do man, as a man who had made a success of his life. In Bordeaux, Goya lived with a younger woman, Leocadia Weiss, and her 2 children. He tutored her daughter, Rosario, in art, and in a letter boasted about the talent of this 10-year-old and her interest in miniature painting. This might have inspired Goya's own experimentation, leading him to create 40 miniatures during the winter of 1825, one of which is on the left, showing a young woman and an older woman, often identified as the Spanish Celestina. The piece, by the way, measures about 2 inches square. He enjoyed walking in the city, and in a drawing on the right in the Morgan, he records one of the amusements of the city's fair in 1826. He discovered, I think, the gift of old age, having realized it is best to take joy in each day, for the days are numbered. Rather than an isolated or embittered old man, my guess is that he understood the mirth of the dancing figures in his earlier Disparate, and that of the old man he imagined in a late drawing, on a swing, suspended in midair, grinning widely as he flies high. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice, for that talk. I'm going to invite our viewers to share questions if they have them in our chat. So it might just take a minute or 2 before we see a few of those. Everyone was listening carefully, so no one was typing while you were speaking. So maybe I can start us off with a question. I'm curious about, I myself am a printmaker, and wondering if you have any insight into kind of the process of printmaking as opposed to the process of painting when it came to that period or any period of Goya's life, especially in regard to, you talked about, him pushing the limits of representation, and he's, seen as ushering us into the modern era. So do you see a difference between those media, I suppose, is my question, in terms of what he was doing as an artist?
That's a great question. And one that requires a lot of thought. I mean, as I think of some of the images we looked looked at. I think in some ways his prints are more modern than his paintings. I showed those scenes of the Inquisition, those imagined scenes of the procession with men flagellating themselves, and the Inquisition, and they are, they are very different and unique, but they still have a certain, they adhere to rules of space and perspective in a certain way. Well, not quite rules, but they create a scene versus something like the Disparate, where you just have these figures, against a barren black background. And I just wonder, well, when he did that in the Disparates, then is that where the Disparates sort of a launching point for what he would do in the lower floor of the black paintings in the House of the Desma, in the Quinta del Sordo with the black paintings. But the other thing that comes up is I think there is an interplay. For example, I showed the altarpiece of the Arrest of Christ, which he was working on in the 1790s. And he was working on it, I said it was finished in January 1799, because in January he sent it to the academicians to show it off before he sent it to Toledo. But there, for example, if you remember, Christ's robe is drained to a pink. That composition really depends a lot more on tone than it does on color, which and it's interesting because I couldn't go into an explanation, but it's also meant to hang, or a reaction to another major altarpiece in that same sacristy, which is the Taking of Christ by El Greco, in which Christ is in this brilliant red robe. So Goya reacts by really toning it down, the color, and working more in tone. And I've always thought that that's because that's how he was thinking, because all this work in drawing during the 1790s and in printmaking, so it sort of affected then how he painted. So I think it's a question that is really worth more attention than I can give it, but I think it's a great question. And those are just two examples I can think of to try to approach it at this point.
Thank you, Janice. So I have a question from our printmaking professor here in the Fine Arts Department at WSU. It's very specific. Kevin Haas is asking, some of the prints that Janice showed from Disparates have a number and a title, but the prints on display in our museum don't. So Kevin's curious to know if you know why that may be.
Some of those, okay, so Goya pulled some proofs. He pulled working proofs, but then he also the ones that are with the title, Jesus Avega, who's an expert on prints in Spain and has worked a lot on Goya's prints, considers them not proofs, but just impressions before letters. So, and she suggests that he did number them. He did number the series, as he had also done this with the Disasters of War. He assigned them early numbers as if he was working out some kind of order. But I really have to look at the specific, but in the end, those numbers were not with Disparates engraved on the plates. They're just ordered. How would they have been ordered? I assume they were just ordered as the Academy wished to order them. The Disasters of War had been ordered by Goya, and he left a bound copy that served as the model for the Disasters of War that the Academy published the year before the Disparates. With the Disparates, I should know that, but I don't. So I assume that the academicians in 1864 decided the numbering. Printmakers ask really hard questions, and I will say that I'm always intimidated by printmakers, because though I've co-taught with a printmaker and I've observed making things, I am not. So I always go to a good friend in Charleston, South Carolina, and ask her my printmaking questions. So is there any question that's not from a printmaker? Because you're really intimidating me.
Yes, I think our final question will not be about printmaking. So Jerry is asking if you can speak to whether Goya was particularly religious or otherwise, and then of course I'm assuming how that may have influenced, especially the work that we looked at today.
Hmm. I don't think he was more particularly religious than many people of his time. He wasn't, but he was married in a church. He was he was obviously accepted as a good Catholic because the church commissioned so many works of him. So my guess is that yes, I don't know if after his deafness he felt he had to go to mass, but he was married in the Catholic Church, and so yes. But the other thing is, and then what makes Goya's religious painting so wonderful, and I don't think I showed you the Saints Rusa and Rufina. I certainly don't think that's one of his great religious paintings. But something like the Arrest of Christ is that he really seems to have read the texts and really rethinks the scene as an almost natural scene that takes place. That is, he's not dependent on necessarily, how other artists. He imagines the scene as a real scene in history. So I think if he imagines it as a real scene in history, that would suggest that he believed it to be a scene in history. Early on, he heads his letters with the sign of the cross, which was again, a friend in Spain tells me was common for letter writers to just begin with the sign of the cross. That again suggests that he accepted the religion. And of course, he grew up in Saragossa, which is a town absolutely dominated by the Catholic Church. I mean, as landowners, and his father was a gilder, and all of his father's commissions would have come from the church. So yeah, the church was very much part of his youth, and his religion was probably just instilled in him. And I'm not quite sure he thought. I don't think he considered not being a Catholic as an option, and an option to not be a Catholic.
Thank you so much, Janice.
Okay.
I'll
okay, thank you.
No.
Okay.
We have a few more minutes. I don't have any other questions in the chat. So I can pause for one more minute and see if anyone else wants to share one. And if not, we can make our closing remarks, but I'll just give people one more minute.
Kristen, can I ask a quick question?
Please. I'd love it.
First off, Janice, thank you for a marvelous talk. It was so informative. My question has to do with the Disaster of Wars etching series. I'm curious to what degree Goya would have experienced the atrocities that he depicts. Maybe a lot less than we might assume. Anything you could say about that, I'd appreciate.
Yeah, well, Goya was in Madrid for most of the war. And so I think many of the battlefield scenes, many of the torture scenes that seem to take place on the battle were imagined. And the thing is, Goya, I showed that, or I mentioned early on, I showed the painting of the Strolling Players, which was a small painting. He continued to do those small paintings, and they show up in collections of the time. So we know he found a market for small paintings. And in those small paintings, he shows pictures of rape and atrocity and an attack on a military encampment, probably painted before, the war. And so he, again, in sort of going beyond commissioned subject matter, he often went into atrocity and cruelty. So I think that's some background for how he would imagine the atrocity of the war. The scenes of the famine, however, I mean, that was, I think, inspired by what he would have seen on the streets of Madrid. I mean, Madrid, I think at the beginning of the war had a population about 150,000, and it's estimated about 26,000 people died. And, if you can imagine what an early 19th century city was like, with that happening. It was brutal. So, and then the final place where I showed those people torturing the French soldier, that is part of a series, part of the disasters of war that early were considered separate, since they aren't war or famine. They were considered emphatic capriccios. And the scenes are all over the place. They suggest allegory. They suggest possibly comments on the returning government or on the political turmoil. So those, again, were created after, and if you look at them all together, are really quite different from, as I said, on nice plates. Because the disasters of war, what's amazing about them, if you put them all together, the scenes he created during the war go from plates that measure about 6 by 10 inches to plates that measure maybe, well, the smallest are about 5.5 inches square, because he cut another plate in half, because during the war it was so hard to get the copper to etch the plates. So he created them on pitted plates, created them on bad plates. So those change, and then you have those capriccios and faticos that are all engraved on, nice uniform plates. So, but again, I think Goya pulled so much of what he saw from his enlightened mind. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Janice.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure.
I just copied some information into our chat too, but I think those of us who may have seen the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art exhibition for Los Disparates already maybe want to come back after hearing what Janice has had to say. I know I need to return to it many, many times. And as Janice has explained, we can't really necessarily have a definitive answer about these. I think they're to be experienced in a number of ways. So please come and see us at the museum if you are in our area. We are open Tuesday through Friday from 1 to 4 p.m. And we're open on Saturdays from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. And we have COVID guidelines in place. Of course, you can visit our website to see what those are. So thank you so much, Janice, for your lecture tonight. And come and see us the next time you're in Western Washington, please. Eastern Washington, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you to all that joined today. We appreciate it.
Good.